I want to talk about legacy incomes in context, and first of all talk about the legacy sector overall, and then home in on hospices in particular. So just to set the scene, legacy income is worth, in total, we think around £3 billion a year. And that's obviously a very significant sum of money. But if you put it in the context of the total money that's left in estates, it's only 3.5% of all the money that's left to family, friends, neighbours, and charities. So obviously there's a huge potential to grow that total sum. If you look across the not-for-profit sector as a whole, so all 170,000 odd charities, then legacies represent 16% of voluntary income and 8% of total income. But in a way, that's probably a misleading statistic, in that some of the big charities that we work with, for instance, people like the Lifeboats and Cancer Research UK and the Guide Dogs and RSPCA, legacies can represent a third to a half of their total income. So it's a really significant source. And as Catherine's just said, for hospices too, it's around a fifth of your total income. So it's a really important source of funding for the future. 6% of all deaths result in a charitable legacy. And again, that's a relatively low figure when you think about the number of people that choose to give money to charities when they're alive. And that's something that we think should be increased. But setting aside all the statistics for a moment, I think there's another reason, the most important reason why legacies matter, is because whether somebody's leaving £500 or £5,000 or £50,000 or in some cases £5 million to a charity, that is probably the biggest and most heartfelt donation that they'll ever give across the course of their lives. And it's a signal of a really strong emotional connection to that charity. So that's why I think legacies really matter. So the first thing to remember about legacies is that they very much echo what's going on in the economy as a whole. And that's something that we found out very early when we started 25 years ago analysing legacy market. And I guess that's not at all surprising when you think about people's estates and what's in those estates. So generally speaking, it's their house, it's their financial assets, things like stocks and shares, savings in the bank account, ISAs and so on, the cash under the bed. And in a few cases, it's effects. So it might be, I don't know, a painting or a yacht or a piece of jewellery. So those financial assets, the value of them reflects what's happening in the economy overall. And what you can see if you look back over the last 25 years is that total legacy incomes have moved in cycles. So there's been periods when they've been growing very fast, and there's been periods when they've been growing much more slowly. And in fact, from 1995-6 to 2006-7, legacy incomes were growing 6, 7 or 8% a year. So it was a real boom period. And that was a time when the economy was also doing very well. And then in late 2007, early 2008, what happened? We had the start of the global recession, the markets crashed, house prices dropped, and we could see an almost instantaneous impact in terms of the income that our big charity clients were seeing. They dropped back by about 10% over the course of 6 months, and then they bobbled around. They were largely flat for 3 or 4 years, and then when the economy started to recover, then legacy incomes grew too. So for the last 5 years, up to, say, late 2016, early 2017, legacy incomes have been growing again. The next point to make is that the residual bequests that you receive account for the bulk of your income. So I'm sure you're all very aware of this from your own work. You have two main types of bequests. So there's cash bequests, which is a fixed amount of money that somebody leaves in their will, and they tend to be relatively small, so maybe £500, £1,000, £5,000. On average, across our consortium, it's £3,000 per pecuniary or cash bequest. And then you get what's called a residual bequest, which is where somebody leaves the rest of their estate once they've paid any other beneficiaries to the charity. And those, generally speaking, are much larger. So on average, again, across our consortium, £60,000 is the average value of a residual bequest. But that figure is kind of pulled upwards by a few exceptionally large bequests. So I'm sorry, I have to look over my shoulders because I can't actually, I've put my glasses on, but then I can't see you, so I'm a bit stymied, I'm afraid. Residual bequests account for 87% of income, and they account for less than half of all bequests. But the larger residual bequests, so the ones that are worth over £100,000, just because of the sheer value of them, only 8% of gifts fall into that category, but they account for 57% of total income. And in fact, if you look at the really, really large bequests, so the ones that are worth over £250,000, for our consortium, they're worth around a third of total income. So yes, clearly all gifts are very valuable, but some gifts are more significant than others. So that means that legacy income is inevitably volatile. So Catherine was saying that across this group, some charities have seen their legacy income rise over the last year, some have seen it fall. Is this a blip? Is this a trend? I would say, with my 25 years of experience, that it's not a trend, it's a blip. There are trends coming, but the fact that some of you are doing not so well in legacies at the moment is probably because you're a relatively small charity, you don't get that many legacies a year, and so your income is hugely influenced by whether or not you get one or two large bequests, and that will make a big difference to you. This is an issue for all charities, even Cancer Research UK. If they get a £10 million bequest, that can influence on their income projections for the year. Or if you think about Shelter, for example, Shelter's average annual income was around £4 million a year. They then received one £10 million bequest, so overnight it went from £4 million to £14 million. But it does mean, because of this volatility, that it's very hard to see the wood for the trees, I guess. So it's important that when you're looking at your legacy performance, you look back over as long a period as possible. Don't just look at the recent past, but also that you look more widely at what other people are doing. So you put yourselves in the context of the sector as a whole, rather than just looking at your own performance. So when it comes to those all-important residual values, they are very, very closely aligned to the housing market, as you might expect. There's a very strong correlation between house prices and residual values. And obviously, house prices do vary enormously from one part of the country to the other. So when it comes to our large national charity clients, that kind of doesn't make any difference because they've probably got a fairly spread bet of estates across the country. But if you're a hospice and you're working in a particular catchment area, obviously the housing market in your catchment is the most important thing to understand. And you don't need me to tell you that house prices do vary enormously from one region to another. So Yorkshire and Humberside, where I come from, it's around £160,000 for an average house price. London is currently at about £480,000. And for the last 5 or 6 years, well, last decade, I guess, the gap between London and the South East and the rest of the country has been widening. But at the moment, we're actually seeing a slight reversion of that because London house prices particularly are starting to drop back, and probably they're going to fall back more because it's London and the South East that's particularly impacted by what's going to happen with Brexit. So as an honorary Northerner, I say that's a good thing, that there's a little bit of a reversion going on. Don't know if you can see that picture there from the back. Obviously, in terms of where we are now and what's going to happen over the next few years, we are in a period of almost unprecedented uncertainty due to Brexit. Now, I started using this picture just after the referendum result in 2016, and it was that sense of uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen, but I kind of thought it was just a short-term thing, and as soon as we'd negotiated a deal on Brexit, things would start to get calmer, the uncertainty would die down, businesses and households would start to get on track again. What's happened? If anything, I would say that the fog has deepened, and I'm still using that picture. And in fact, I think I should copyright it because I did notice that Mark Carney, who they often call the George Clooney of the Bank of England, is now talking about the fog of Brexit. So he obviously saw one of my legacy presentations. And that means that there is a huge amount of uncertainty, clearly, about what's going to happen to legacy incomes. I think in the short term, inevitably, legacy incomes are going to be affected by Brexit. We're already seeing that with our own clients, things like houses that they know they've got a house in an estate, but it's taking a lot longer to sell that house because of the uncertainty. House prices are dropping. So short term, it's bound to have an impact. And as I mentioned, we were going through a fairly rosy period when it came to legacy growth over the last 5 years. So up to 2016-17, in the aftermath of the recession, legacy incomes across the board were growing at about 6% a year. Our latest forecast, which we did in September, we said that if we managed to get an orderly, clear Brexit negotiation and a Brexit deal, then incomes would grow by 2.4% a year over the next 5 years. But if we were to crash out of Brexit, and even in September we thought this was an unlikely prospect, then the impact would be far more. So our latest forecast is that if we crash out of Brexit, it will mean around £1.2 billion lost in legacy income over the next 5 years, compared to if we'd had an orderly, agreed Brexit. And that, by my calculations, worked out at about £240 million a year, which makes the £10 million a year lost in probate fees rather small beer in comparison. So I guess it's a watch this space and a slightly depressing picture in terms of the short-term outlook. But again, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning, I think it's really important not to forget that if you look in the longer term, there's a real opportunity arising, and that's coming out of the baby boomers. Now, looking around the room, you're all very fresh-faced. None of you are really baby boomers. You're all far too young to think about it. But they are a very significant group, people born between 1945 and 1965. They're a large group. They're an affluent group. They're generally sort of liberal, confident, charitably minded. And over the next 20, 30 years, they are going to be dying in very large numbers. So I don't know if you can see this here, but the boomers are the purple part of the bar. So in 2010, the number of boomers who was dying was really quite small. Still by 2020, the bulk of deaths are going to be amongst the war baby generation, so people born around the war, and older people, say my parents' generation. But by 2030, which is not as far away as you might think it is, it starts to become a really significant factor. And that goes through to 2040 and 2050. So those baby boomers are a huge opportunity, despite the fact that the kids are going to be sucking up all their money and there'll be nothing left for them. As I mentioned before, they are very confident, and they are also quite demanding in the way that they treat suppliers of all types. And I think they often see charities as suppliers in much the same way as they see their supermarket or their bank or their mobile phone company. And they have quite a consumerist approach to customer service. So when we've been running focus groups on boomer legators, the sort of things that we hear them say is, first of all, it's about tangibility. So they want to see, they want to be able to picture what it is that their money is going to do. So what difference it's going to make, what buildings it's going to create, what beds it's going to create, what new staff is it going to create. They want to be able to see that in their mind's eye. It's also about transparency. So that sense that they want to know where their money is going and that money is going to be well spent. And it's kind of perverse sense almost of control that, okay, they might accept that at some point they're going to have to die, but they want to feel that they're still going to have control over their legacy when they're gone. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more and more restricted bequests going into people's wills, where people are specifying not just to give it to a specific charity, but to give it to a particular project or a particular place or a particular thing that matters to them, that's extra important. We're also seeing increasing competition. So when we started our legacy work 25 years ago, those 13 charities that we work with probably represented a big chunk of the market between them. And those big charities are still really important, but they are gradually losing share to much smaller, much younger, more contemporary, and often local organisations. So that's really good news as far as hospices are concerned. And when you see the types of sectors that are growing the fastest now, it's things like air ambulances, NHS hospitals, wildlife trusts, certainly things like overseas development charities, arts organisations, education, particularly universities. Now, these are all small sectors at the moment, but that's where a lot of the dynamism is. And those people are all actively promoting legacies, employing legacy managers, sending out legacy messages to your supporters. So it's becoming a much more competitive sector than before. And interesting, I'll come back to this later on, but hospices, as you see, is not at the very right-hand side of this chart. It's not one of the fastest growing sectors. If I'd done this chart 5 years ago, as I probably did, then hospices would have been right on the right-hand side. But for some reason, you're starting to lag behind some of those other new growth sectors. And I have a theory about that, which I'll share with you shortly. So when it comes to the very fastest growing legacy, what we call the legacy leaders, I won't go through all of these, but you can see the types of organisations that are doing particularly well in terms of growing their legacy income at the moment. How are we doing for time? Okay. Oh, fine. So that's the sector overall. Let's focus in on the hospice sector. So giving to health charities is the largest type of legacy giving. I think health charities together represent about 40% of all legacy income. And within that, hospices represent 20% of the health sector. So by far the biggest cause area within health is cancer, then hospices, and then medical conditions of all sorts. So it's lumping together things like arthritis, Alzheimer's, cystic fibrosis, asthma, all sorts of different medical conditions. Then the NHS hospitals, and then sort of heart organisations, which is largely the British Heart Foundation with a few others. And then air ambulances, which is a very small group, but it is growing incredibly rapidly. So you're 20% of the total health sector. But when it comes to growth, you're actually lagging behind a lot of those other subsectors that I mentioned. So all health charities have seen their legacy income grow by 7% a year, bearing in mind this is before the recession hit again. The fastest growing sector, as I mentioned, is air ambulances, but they are very small. NHS hospitals are doing well, heart organisations and cancer organisations. And hospices, quite surprisingly, I think, 6.4%. It's good growth, but it's not as good as you might expect, given that strong local appeal that you've got and the fact that you are so very well connected in your localities. You've also got a very wide spread of incomes when you look at individual charities. So across the hospice sector as a whole, according to our calculations, the average legacy income is £1 million. But obviously it does vary from one end of the scale to the other. So by far the largest hospice charity, it's no great surprise, St Christopher's Hospice, 5.7 million, followed by Princess Alice Hospice, St Barnabas, St Anne's and Children's Hospice South West. And all of those charities, I would say, are ones that if you did a league table year after year, they would appear at the top end of the league table. And then when you get down to the next level, probably numbers 5, 6 through to 10, and that on from there, it really varies from one year to the next as to which charities appear in that group. And that's because of that volatility that I mentioned, that sometimes you get good years, sometimes you get bad years, sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down. Coming back to the point about house prices that I mentioned before, we did some analysis this year of hospices by location and the total income by location. And what we found, which was no great surprise, was that hospices in the southeast and in London received the highest level of income. Now, I'm sure you'd all say, as those hospices, it's because you're very efficient and that you've got a particularly good relationship with your beneficiary, with your donors, and I'm sure that's true, but it's also because house prices in those areas are particularly high, so that feeds through into the value of the legacies that you receive. Back in 2017, we did some work with a group of hospices in the southeast of England. And I should just embarrass Nigel Seymour for a moment at this point. Nigel was the person that pulled the consortium together, and I think he's a really great advocate for legacy fundraising in the hospice sector. So I'm really pleased to see that he's speaking today. But the idea was to try and get a sense of how that group of charities was performing, both against each other, but also compared to the wider marketplace. It was a fairly small group. It was just 8 charities. But I think that the messages that came through for those 8 charities and the implications more widely were quite clear-cut. So what we saw, we analysed their legacy income by type and their legacy notifications by type over the last 5 years, and we found that in terms of the growth, those charities were doing better than the legacy sector overall was. So the income grew by 6.3% a year compared to 5.4% a year for the wider Legacy Monitoring Consortium. But the main reason why income was growing was because of the growth in average values. And I guess, given that they were all in the southeast of England, very buoyant housing market, you were seeing the impact of the house prices on their legacy income. But rather worryingly, the number of bequests that were being received was actually growing more slowly than the Legacy Monitoring Consortium overall. And that's surprising. It certainly surprised us, particularly given the fact that you're all small charities, and small charities tend to see faster growth rates than bigger ones. So it seems as if you're not capitalising fully, and a lot of the growth that has been seen is based on what's happening on the economy and factors outside of your control, rather than the number of legacies being driven by the marketing activity that you're doing. The other very striking factor was that I mentioned before that income is skewed towards a few large gifts generally, and that was even more extreme when it came to those hospices. So in their case, 10% of gifts accounted for 2/3 of all income. So very much dependent on receiving a one-off large legacy, which, as you all know, is very difficult to predict when that's going to come in or not come in, rather than that underlying groundswell of good numbers of smaller legacies coming through on a year-by-year basis. What we also found was that the capacity to do legacy fundraising inside those hospices was really very low, despite the fact that I would say they were probably some of the better resourced organisations across the hospice sector. So across the 8 charities, they spent in total £70,000 a year on legacy fundraising, excluding any staff costs. And based on that, they received, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to put my glasses on again, £230 worth of legacy income for every £1 that they spent on legacy marketing. Now, that doesn't mean that you spend £1 on legacy marketing and you get £230 back, because obviously there's a huge gap between when you spend the money and when that money comes through. But relative to the legacy income, the spend was very low. Now, you could say that's fantastic. You know, you're very efficient. You don't need to spend any more money. But I would say that's actually a lost opportunity, because if you were spending more, you could be achieving a lot more from that money. And again, across the 8 charities, in total, they employed just 2 full-time equivalent fundraisers, so equivalent of a quarter of a full-time fundraiser per charity. And again, the money that was brought in for each of those fundraisers was higher than the national picture. But what would happen if you increased the number of fundraisers to 1 even per charity rather than the quarter? What impact would that have on your legacy income? So I suppose to us it struck us as, you know, is this really about efficient management, or is it a lost opportunity? So if I was to sum up in a nutshell what I hope I've been talking about over the last half an hour, legacies are a vital income source, and they account for 1/5 of your total legacy income. And I think because of the type of organisations that you are, you do really have a natural, emotional and practical connection to legacy donors. So the legacy ask for you should be a lot easier than it is for some of the charities that we work with. And I know that Ashley Rowthorne, for instance, is going to talk more about this later on today. There is a lot of uncertainty around at the moment in terms of legacy incomes. But if you're looking further ahead, if you're looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead, we genuinely believe that there's a huge opportunity because of the baby boomers. The competition's getting stronger, so you certainly can't afford just to sit back and thank and bank. You've got to do more if you want to compete with those universities, wildlife trusts, air ambulance organisations. And you really need to grow the number of bequests that you receive rather than just relying on the odd windfall coming in. Investment in people and budgets is very low, even relative to your size. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. And we need more insight. I think as a group, we need more insight to help us to drive the strategies. So if we're going to realise our legacy potential, we need more insight on a whole variety of things. And again, I think it's something that Nigel's going to talk more about later. So how are we performing relative to other hospices, and why? What is it that makes your performance different? Should we be investing more money and more staff in legacy fundraising? What's our long-term legacy potential, which is clearly really important if you're trying to plan your operations over a 5 or a 10-year period? What's the risk profile of the future income? And also, why do our legacy donors choose us? So in the light of so much competition from other types of cause area, what makes somebody choose to leave a legacy to their local hospice? So I want to finish with, I guess, a plug, but it's more a call to arms, perhaps, to the sector. As I mentioned before, we have a limited number of hospice charities within our main Legacy Monitor programme. And my sense is that that's because Legacy Monitor, the main programme, is dominated by big charities, and it's of limited use to a hospice to know what's happening to Cancer Research UK or Multiple Sclerosis Society or the RSPCA. What you guys want to understand about is what's happening to other hospices, and I get that. I also get the fact that your budgets are not as high as other big national charities are. So my vision is that in the long term, we create a benchmarking programme that's specifically aimed at hospices. We need to have a critical mass of hospices behind it to make it worthwhile. So let's say a group of 30 or more hospices with a combined income of £75 million plus. It would be an annual service rather than a quarterly service, which is what we currently offer to our big charity clients, on a named charity basis. So you could all see how the other hospices in the group were performing. And also you'd get access to the top line findings of the main Legacy Monitor programme. So you could see how your performance related to the bigger sector. And in return, you would give them access to a little bit of your information. Not a huge amount, but just enough so that they understood where hospices fitted. You'd supply your data through First Class Web, which is why it's so important that Clear are here today. And you'd get access to the results through a password-protected website. So you could look at the findings whenever you wanted to, and it would be updated when new information came through. And there'd be an annual seminar to debate the findings. Now, one of the advantages of being quite as old in the tooth as I am, and having been around the block lots of times, is that I know that that's a lovely vision, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So the pragmatic solution is to produce an interim approach, which is what we'd like to launch this year, which is if we could bring together a group of 15 or more hospice charities, and they have a combined legacy income of more than £40 million, then we produce, again, the same tailored annual benchmarking service. Rather than using an electronic way of submitting the data, we'd use spreadsheets, and rather than you looking at the data on the website, there would be PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheets. So that's what we're working towards proposals at the moment. We hope to launch it in summer 2019, and our provisional cost at the moment is £2,300 per hospice charity. Now, I know they'll be sucking in of teeth and saying, oh, £2,300, it's a lot of money, we can't afford that. But I would say to you, if you could get one extra cash gift at a value of £3,000 as a result of that extra insight, that would be money extremely well spent. So, I've got no idea how long I've spoken for. I've probably overrun enormously. If there's time for any questions, I'll happily take them. But thank you very much for listening.